This video is all about sprites. And sprites are a type of texture in Unity. And when we say texture, we mean a JPEG, a PNG, an image. And we use textures a lot of different ways in Unity. So a wood texture might be applied to a 3D model. This skybox texture would appear in the background of a scene. And I might want to use this Unity logo PNG in, say, a UI element, or as a 2D sprite for a 2D game. Either way, I need to turn this texture into a sprite. And to understand why we have to do that, you have to understand that when we use textures in different ways, Unity is going to store those textures differently, it's going to apply those textures differently, and there are going to be different import settings for the textures specific to these specific use cases. So what we need to do is we need to tell Unity that I want to use this as a sprite. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the texture type. So first we're going to click on it in the project and then change the texture type to sprite. And Unity helpfully tells us sprites are for 2D games and UI elements. When I do that, I then have to click apply. And now Unity knows that this particular texture is a sprite. And what you'll see is this little arrow to the right, and if we open that up, that'll show us the sprite that was created from that texture. We can actually create multiple sprites from a single texture. And why might we want to do that? Well, one thing is if we're creating a UI, we might want to have different states for, say, a button. We might want to have a hover state and a pressed state and a normal state for the button. And those might be different sprites. We can create them all in a single image. We can lay them out in a single image. And then when we import, note that when we set this to sprite, our import options changed, and one of them was the sprite mode. Instead of having a single sprite, we can actually select multiple sprites, and we can open up a Sprite Editor and define how those different sprites should be split out from that single image. And we're not going to cover to that depth in this video, but just know that there are a lot of options available when you're working with sprites in 2D. Another thing that's important in these import settings is if you have transparency. And this image does. So if you were to open this up in something like Photoshop, you'd see that it has a transparent background, but Unity doesn't know about that yet. So if you ever see that your image doesn't have appropriate transparency, you need to go down to the advanced settings and look at the alpha source. And our alpha channel is the channel that defines our transparency of our image. So we need to say that we are going to read our alpha channel. The source of our alpha is the alpha of the input texture. So when you're working with something like a PNG, it's going to store that transparency for you. We need to tell Unity to pull it out. And then we need to make sure that this box is checked. Alpha is transparency. So the alpha channel of our PNG or our Photoshop or whatever other file tells us the transparency of the image. And once we apply those, now we can see that our image has a transparent background and it'll render correctly in our UI. And again, there are a whole bunch of other settings in here that you can set. Those are out of scope for this video, but we'll cover those in other videos. So we have this now set up, and we can now use this in UI elements. For instance, the image UI element. We can also use these as sprites in a 2D game. And to show you that, I'm actually going to turn this back to a default texture real quick. I'm going to open up my image, and I'm going to try and drag this in, and you'll see that it won't let me use this, because it specifically wants a sprite for the image. So if I go back over, I change this back into a sprite, I hit apply, you'll note that it saved all of my settings, so I have that wonderful transparency. And then I go back to my image, and then I drag this in, it lets me, it's happy. And now I can use that in my UI elements. And one thing to remember with UI elements is that even complex elements like a button or a slider, at the end of the day, they're made of simpler components. So a slider is really just a bunch of images, and a button has an image as a background. So I can use these things that I've imported, and I can overwrite the defaults if I want to skin my elements a certain way. If I have a style guide and I want to make them look appropriate, I want them to match. And that really is all that there is to it in working with sprites in Unity. Just as a recap, we've got a bunch of different image types. We have to make sure that we tell Unity that we want our image to be a sprite and not something else. And then we may want to set a couple of import settings, and once we do, we can use any PNG, any JPEG as a sprite in our UI.